Hello, my name is Julia, and this is Fanzine, where rock and roll is the best education. Today we're going to talk about one of the most influential bands of all time, leaders of the British invasion, Roger Daltrey, Keith Moon, John Entwistle, and Peter Townsend. You know them, they're The Who. So this is going to be a lot of information because they have a really large legacy and a huge catalog. So bear with me, and hopefully this is an enjoyable experience for the both of us as a big fan of The Who, and hopefully if you're not a fan of The Who, or if you are, you just enjoy the information and the shared interest in this really, really great band. So we'll start off with a bit of background on our protagonists. To use the language of their native land, as young lads growing up in London, Pete, John, and Roger all attended the same high school, where, fun fact, Roger was actually expelled because there was a rumor that he wanted to set fire to the school. So John and Pete started a jazz band called the Confederates, and then Pete got enrolled in Ealing Art School, so John joined Roger's band, the Detours. And fun fact about John, he actually built his first bass with his own two hands. And Pete was soon invited to join on guitar, while Keith was starting his drumming career in Middlesex, unknown to any of the other boys. So, to catch up, because that is kind of confusing, Pete, John, and Roger are all in their own band called the Detours, and Keith is off doing his own little drumming thing. So, in 1964, they changed their name to The Who and played a few gigs with a session drummer, and they were approached by Keith Moon, who said, and I quote, this is a quote from Roger Daltrey, he said, "I hear you're looking for a new drummer. Well, I'm much better than the guy you've got," which is just quintessentially Keith Moon. So Keith joined the band, and that's when things got really interesting. So I'm going to take a pause from talking about the history of The Who and just talk about Keith Moon as a drummer, because I'm a drummer. For those of you listening that don't know, I'm a drummer. I'm a fairly new drummer, so I'm no expert by any means. But Keith Moon was one of the reasons why I became a drummer, because his drumming is just so powerful. It's so energetic and crazy, and something that's quintessential about each of the members of The Who was that they played each of their instruments, or sang for Roger, like it was a main instrument. And you see that with Keith Moon. He plays his drums as a leading instrument, not as backup. He just tears the drum set apart, and it was an energy that no one had ever seen before. He was crazy on drums. So they started playing gigs with Keith, and at one point, Townsend, he jumped up and hit his guitar against the ceiling, and it put a hole through the ceiling. So he was really angry, and he just decided to smash his guitar. And nothing like that had ever been done on stage before, because before that, music was very classy. Like, you'd go to see a show, and there'd be these boys dressed up in button-up shirts, and they'd play some music, and it was, like, jazzy and cool, and the kids got excited by it. But Townsend straight up smashed his guitar on stage, and everyone was really, like, confused and excited, and it's kind of cathartic for everyone around. So many people started coming to the shows just to see Townsend smash his guitar, and venues had to start turning down people because there's so many people coming. And then that's when The Who realized that they were kind of getting big and kind of getting popular, so they couldn't do covers anymore. They were just covering songs. So they realized that all the successful bands at the time were writing songs, so they found a songwriter in Pete Townsend. He wrote I Can't Explain, which is one of my favorite songs by The Who, because it's just so simple and fun, and it's very cheery. And it not only made it to the number 8 charts on the Now Musical Express charts, but it actually got them signed to Brunswick Records. And that's when they really blew up. They were playing multiple shows a day and taking amphetamines to stay awake, which of course did not help them as musicians or bandmates. Drugs don't help in almost any situation when it comes to music or vocals or anything like that. This kind of tension between the band caused Roger Daltrey to flush the drugs down the toilet, and he was subsequently fired from the band. Spoiler alert, this is not the first time Roger gets fired from the band. But don't worry, they let him back in 4 weeks later, and they recorded My Generation, which I mentioned because it is my favorite record by The Who. In terms of like an album, that's just my favorite album because it's so just young and cheery and youthful. and just classic, like, rock and roll. I really love it. So anyway, at this point, Pete was tired of writing simple little rock songs, so he wrote a revolutionary kind of rock opera called A Quick One While He's Away. This set the precedent for all of their future concept albums, like their really big projects, and actually all future rock operas and concept albums, which leads me to Tommy. So they play Monterey Pop Festival, release I Can See for Miles, and start a US tour. It's on this tour that Pete proposes a story about this deaf, dumb, and blind kid whose only form of communication with the world is through vibrations. He feels vibration of music. I'm not going to give away too much of the story. Go watch the movie or listen to the album. It's incredible. It is a life-changing experience personally for me. Not only is it magical musically, but also historically. This is the first pretty much like full-on, well-thought-out concept album in music history. Without Tommy, there wouldn't be Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. There wouldn't be The Wall by Pink Floyd, and even more recently, there wouldn't be albums like American Idiot. It's so quintessential in the history of rock and roll that I think everyone should listen to it or watch the movie. Very good. I mean, like, you know, A Quick One While He's Away kind of set like a little foundation, and Tommy just took that and completely reimagined it and made it a full story. And the cool thing about Tommy is it also kind of emphasized the importance of not necessarily concept albums or records that tell a story, but album-oriented music. And while this was a thing, because obviously when you have vinyl records, you have to listen to the album at a time, this was a well put together album, and they really thought about the order of the songs and how everything needs to sound together. And that's when making albums became an art form. It wasn't just a compilation of, you know, little hits and tracks and stuff like that. It was an undertaking. You had to work hard to make an album. And I'll be perfectly honest, I don't really listen to pop music right now, so I don't know if that's still going on, but all my personal favorite albums and favorite artists are artists that make really good, solid albums. And I think that kind of culture started with Tommy. So eventually they go on tour with Tommy, and they actually play Tommy at the Metropolitan Opera House, which is a huge step for rock and roll being taken seriously, because you have all of these like rich music like snobs that are going to the opera, and then they get blasted by like all of this rock and roll, and it's just the coolest thing. And I of course, I was not alive to witness this, but God, would I have loved to be in that opera house to see all these, like, old people that usually go to see, like, you know, a nice little opera or an orchestra, which is fine, but then they get bombarded by rock and roll. Like, I just think that that's the coolest thing on earth. So, with the success of Tommy, everyone kept on asking Pete, so, like, what's next? To which he responded, who's next? Oh God, that's really bad pun. But anyway, Who's Next ended up being their best-selling album. But actually, before Who's Next, Pete had a project called Lighthouse, but it didn't really make sense to anyone besides Pete, so it was scrapped and replaced with Who's Next. And Who's Next is an important album because it very boldly used a synthesizer as the opening to the album, and it was a very long synthesizer intro for Baba O'Riley. And that's just a very cool exploration into the structure of an album and testing kind of the patience of people wanting to listen to this really good song on the radio or on an album. And people were saying you shouldn't open a song with such a long synthesizer intro because no one's going to play it on the radio, and here we are in 2017 and the song is still played on classic rock radio. So I think that's just a testament to how good the actual song is. So another important aspect of Who's Next is that it reflected Pete's internal struggle with the constant pressure of being the primary creator through songs like Behind Blue Eyes. This kind of feeling of being overwhelmed by pressure and wanting some control extended onto their next album, Quadrophenia, where Pete really wanted to have some control over what was going on, so he took over pretty much the entire thing and was very possessive. This caused tensions, and it was a very difficult album to perform live, which led to exhaustion and physical fights between Roger and Pete on stage. At this point, the drugs also began to change, and not in a good way. Although everyone, including their managers, dabbled in, cocaine and other kinds of drugs, the person most immersed in the rapid increase of drugs and feeling of invincibility that came with being famous was our beloved Keith Moon. He would pretty much drink, inject, or snort anything that was given to him because he thought he was invincible. He was like, yeah, I'm the drummer of The Who, I can do anything, which obviously he can't. He had a body that was fragile. So he would often play drunk and drugged to the point where he would pass out on his drum kit, on stage, in the middle of playing. And while that's really awful and terrible, I think an interesting story came out of this when one time they were playing and Keith blacks out, they pull him off stage, and Pete asks the audience if anyone knows how to play drums. Sure enough, they plucked out a young boy from the audience, and he gets to play drums with The Who, which is, I can imagine for him, a life-changing experience. So after a break from touring, 1975 rolls in with The Who by Numbers, which was a very good record. I don't have too much to say about it just because it's a good record. There are some very good songs on there, but it's personally not as influential to me as albums like Who's Next and My Generation. But with 1975, punk rock music takes over Britain, and you have bands like the Sex Pistols covering songs by The Who. So Pete started to get worried that this meant it was the end of bands like The Who and the Beatles and the Stones, and that kids weren't going to get interested in their music anymore because they were so immersed in punk rock music. So Pete got drunk one night at a club where a punk band was playing, and he went around to everyone yelling, "Who are you? Who are you?" And he said the same thing to himself in the mirror that night, just, "Who are you?" Which obviously inspired that song called Who Are You, which was featured in their 1977 live performance documentary and on the 1978 album of the same name. At that time, Keith was taking prescription pills to curb his drinking and try to just sober up. And these are actually the same pills that would kill him on September 7th, 1978, a few days after the album was released. That's pretty much where I'm going to end the history of The Who, because, Keith Moon as a drummer to me, and I feel like to The Who and to fans of The Who, will always be the perfect drummer for The Who, and their history afterwards is mostly based upon, legacy. They decided that they weren't going to stop because of the death of Keith Moon, so they did get a new drummer called Kenny Jones. They had a Quadrophenia movie, they had a bunch of box sets and tours, and it did strengthen the connection between Pete and Roger. They felt more connected because they had gone through that death together. In 1990, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They had 2 albums that didn't really do that well, and they officially disbanded in 1983 because Kenny didn't fit as a drummer, and they decided they can't be The Who without Keith Moon as a drummer. But they continued touring again in 1996 with Zak Starkey, who is Ringo Starr's son, on drums, which I think is pretty cool. I think if someone is going to take over the role of Keith Moon, arguably the best drummer on earth, it might as well be someone from Ringo Starr's family, because I think that's just magical. I think that's incredible, and kudos to him. I don't know how good of a drummer he is. I don't know how they work together, but they toured for some time together after that, so he seems to be good. So they continued touring with Zak Starkey. Everything was going well. And on a tour in 2002, John Entwistle overdosed on cocaine in his hotel room, which obviously led to his death. And that really made a huge impact on the band. And they took another break from touring. And from that point, The Who kind of existed as their legacy and the influence they had on other bands. There's so many current bands that are highly influenced by The Who, and not even current, we'll say bands from the 1980s, from the 1990s, from the early 2000s, who were so influenced by The Who and their kind of rebellious nature. I mean, coming out of the times that they were coming out of and being so rebellious and just kind of doing whatever they wanted, smashing instruments, singing about whatever they wanted to sing, not really caring about those like little hip bops and rock tracks. They just kind of did whatever they wanted to do, and I think a lot of bands found that to be admirable and very inspiring. So cool thing is that the Who are actually still touring right now. They have a 2016-2017 tour that's going on right now. I don't know the logistics of where they're going, but you can check it out on the Who website and see if you can get tickets for your local area. And see how Zach Starkey is on drums as well as John Button on bass. I hope that they're great. They seem to be having a lot of fun from what I've seen in terms of like press events and stuff like that. So hopefully they're doing well in concert, and if anyone does see them in concert or has seen them in concert, be sure to comment below and tell me how they're doing. And not only can you get concert tickets at the Who website, but the Who website was actually where I got most of my information for my research, so please go check out their website. They have a great timeline. It's very helpful, very useful if you want a little bit more in-depth knowledge. In addition to the Who website, I also got most of my information, like a great majority of my information, from this documentary called The Amazing Journey, The Story of the Who. It's excellent. It's a very good documentary. I highly recommend everyone go check it out. And let me know down in the comments if you choose to expand your knowledge on the Who, or if you know something that I did not mention in the podcast. Please let me know down in the comments. I love classic rock trivia. I love information. I'm just a big classic rock nerd. So please keep me updated, keep me posted on what you're learning about rock and roll. So yeah, that was the first actual episode of Fanzine, the rock and roll history podcast where rock and roll is the best education. Please let me know what you thought about it. This is the first episode, so if there's anything I can improve upon, if there was anything that was historically inaccurate, please let me know. Comment below. I mostly listen to and I'm very, very familiar with classic rock. But if you throw in some classic punk bands, I'll probably be familiar with them if it's like the Ramones and the Clash and stuff like that. I'm also very familiar with bands like Green Day and Nirvana and whatnot. So, you know, if you find a band interesting and want to know more about their history, please just comment it down below and I'll see if I can do an episode about them. Please follow this SoundCloud page. I am probably going to have some social media soon for this podcast, depending on how well it goes. Maybe I'll establish some sort of Instagram page or whatnot. But yeah, this is a lot of fun, and the Who are a weird one to pick first because their history is so immense and so complicated, but I hope you found it enjoyable. So yeah, remember to just follow the SoundCloud page, and hopefully I'll be posting new episodes weekly. That's kind of my plan, but that might not work so well once school gets started again. But anyway, my name is Julia. This has been Fanzine. Have a nice day. Always listen to music and rock on.